There's a fat unicorn.
Are you going to show it to them?
We got a fat unicorn.
So fat. So squishy.
Also, we're repainting it later.
Okay. All right, here we go. Chapter 3. The rest of that day was not quite as joyful for Peemer. At Dearzen's order, he moved his gear from the senior apprentice dormitory to the drummer's quarters, 4 rooms adjacent to the height, separate from the rest of the hall. The apprentice's room was cramped, and would be more so when the spare cot for Peemer was added. The journeyman's quarters were hardly more spacious, nor Master Alodke's, though he had his small room to himself. The largest room was both for the instruction and living. Beyond, separated by a small hallway, was the drum room, with the great metal message drums shining in the afternoon sun.
Remember that squishy that smelled like a popsicle?
We're reading right now and not talking about squishies.
But it did smell like a popsicle.
That is irrelevant to what I said. There were several stools for the watch drummer, a small work table to write down the messages, and a press which became the bane of Peemer's mornings. It contained the polish and cloths required to keep that eye-blinding shine on the drums. Dearzen took evident relish in telling Peemer that by custom the newest apprentice was required to maintain their brilliance. The drum heights were always manned, save for the dead time, 4 hours in the depth of night, when the eastern half of the continent was still sleeping and the western half just retiring. Peemer wanted to know what happened if an emergency occurred in the dead time, and was crisply informed that most drummers were so attuned to an incoming message that even in the shielded quarters the vibrations had been known to alert them. As part of his apprentice training, Peemer had dutifully learned the identifying beats of each of the major holds and craft halls, and the emergency signals like threadfall, fire, death, answer, question, help, affirmative, negative, and a few useful phrases. When Dearzen first showed him the mass of drum messages that he would be expected to memorize and perform, he began to wish fervently that his voice would settle before winter came. Dearzen ruthlessly loaded him down with a column of frequently used beat measures to learn by the next day, telling him to practice quietly, using sticks on the practice block, and left him. In the morning, writhing under Dearzen's full attention, Peemer struggled through the lesson. He almost cried out with relief when Manoli appeared. She ignored him. "I need a messenger. Can I steal Peemer?" "Certainly," Dearzen said without surprise, since that task was also a function of drum apprentices. "He can practice his lesson on his way, I expect he'd better." Peemer groaned to himself at this partial reprieve, but kept a carefully contrite expression on his face for Dearzen's benefit. "Did you get riding gear yesterday from Sylvina?" Manoli asked him, her face unrevealing. "Get it on," she said when he nodded, gesturing for him to be quick about changing. She was laughing with Dearzen when he reappeared, but broke off her conversation, motioning Peemer to follow her. She took the steps from the drum heights at a clip. "You said you'd ridden runners?" she asked. "Sure, I'm herder bred, you know." He was a bit miffed. "That doesn't necessarily mean that you've ridden runners." "Well, I have." "You'll have a chance to prove it," she said, awarding him a curious smile. Peemer stared hard at her profile as they made their way out of the arch entrance and across the broad gather meadow in front of the Harper Hall. To their left towered the cliff that housed Fort Hold, and the rows of cots that huddled in the bosom of the sturdy precipice. On the fire heights of the hold, the brown dragon stood, looking more massive silhouetted against the bright sky, one wing extended, which his rider was grooming. Peemer felt a surge of reverence for dragons and their riders, reinforced by the sight of Beauty, Manoli's queen fire lizard, alighting on her friend's padded shoulder, while the rest of Manoli's fair cavorted in the air above them. Her head raised, Manoli smiled at her playful friends and told them they were going for a ride. Did they care to come along? Chirping and excited aerial displays greeted her question, and Peemer watched, as ever envious, while Beauty stroked Manoli's cheek with her wedge-shaped head and crooned in her ear, the jewel-faceted eyes bright blue with pleasure. Grimly, Peemer forebore to ask the questions that seethed in his mind as they walked in silence toward the great caverns carved into the fort cliff to house the herd beasts, wary flocks, and runners. Inside the cavern, the head stockman approached with a smile for Manoli. Her fire lizards...
Elliot, no.
Elliot, let your sister get up. Charlotte, can you please get up instead of just being incredibly disruptive? Okay. Sit down and please stop being incredibly disruptive. It's very rude.
I'm not trying to.
Okay. Her fire lizards whirled into the cavern and sought perches on the curious beams that supported the ceiling. beams that had been fashioned by long-lost skill of the ancients. No one even knew from what substance they had been contrived. "Off again, Manoli?" "Again," she said with a slight grimace. "Bannock, have you gear for a beast for Pemer, too? It's easy for me to have the second runner ridden as led." "Course." And the man led the way to the enclosure where the backpacks and headgear were hung on racks. After a close look at Pemer, he selected pad and gear, handed Manoli hers. They followed him down the aisle of open-ended stalls. "Your usual is third down, Manoli. See if Pemer remembers how to go on," she said to Bannock. The man smiled and handed Pemer the gear. With a degree of assurance he didn't feel, Pemer made the clucking sound it was wise to use to announce human presence to a runner beast. They weren't intelligent creatures, responding to a narrow set of noises and nudges, but within that limited scope quite useful. They weren't even pretty, being thin-necked, heavy-headed, long-backed, lean-bodied, with spindly legs. Their hide was covered in a coarse fur and ranged in color from a dirty white to a dark brown. They were more graceful than herd beasts, but by no stretch of the imagination as beautiful as dragons or fire lizards. The creature Pemer was to ride was a dirty brown. He threw the mouth rope over its neck, and by pinching its nose holes, forced it to open its mouth to receive the metal mouthpiece. Quickly grabbing its ear, Pemer managed to get the headstall in place. It snorted as if mildly surprised. Not half as surprised as Pemer that he'd remembered that little trick. He heard Bannock grunt. He slapped the pad in place and tightened the midstrap, wondering if this thing would give him any trouble once he was astride it. Untying its halter, he backed it out and found Manoli in the aisle holding her larger beast. She examined the gear on his. "Oh, he did it right," said Bannock, nodding approval and waving them to go on as he turned to the rear of the cavern on his own affairs. It had been a long time since Pemer had been astride a runner. Fortunately, this creature was docile, and its pacing stride smooth as Manoli set off briskly down the eastern roadway. There was a knack of easing yourself on a runner's pad. Pemer found himself almost unconsciously assuming the position, sitting on one buttock, extending his left leg as far as the toe strap would go, while cocking the knee of his right leg firmly against the runner's side. A rider would change sides often in a trip. For a girl sea-hold bred, Manoli rode with the ease of much practice, Pemer noted. All the way down to the sea-hold, Pemer kept his mouth shut. He'd be scorched if he'd ask her why they were going there. He doubted that the sole purpose of this excursion was to see if he could ride runners or keep his mouth shut. And what had she meant by easier to have a second runner ridden than led? This reticent, assured Manoli on harbor business was quite different from the girl who let him feed her fire lizards, and a long stride from his recollections of the shy and self-effacing newcomer to the harbor hall 3 turns back. Once they reached Fort Sea-hold, Manoli tossed him her beast's mouth rope, told him to take them to the hold's beastmaster, ease the back pads, water them, and see if they could have some feed. As Pemer led the creatures away, he noticed that she went to the harbor wall, shading one hand as she peered at the eastern horizon. Why was she waiting for a ship? Or had that something to do with the drum message from Ista Hold the other morning? The beastmaster greeted him cheerfully enough and helped him attend the runners. "You'll be likely heading back to the hall as soon as the ship docks," said the man. "I'll pad up Sibel's beast so he's ready. Soon as we got these comfortable, you just pop into my hold there, and my woman'll fix you a bite to eat. Boy your age could always do with a bit, I'm sure. One thing about sea holding, you've always the extra to feed, even in threadfall." His hospitality included Manoli when she came in, after Pemer too had seen the speck far out on the sea. He knew that he'd have a chance to rest his weary bones as well as exercise his jaw. Sibel had a runner stabled here, huh? Sibel born by a westbound ship, which suggested that Sibel had also sailed from this sea-hold. Pemer tried to remember how long it had been since he'd seen Sibel about the hall, and couldn't. Fort Sea-hold possessed a natural deep harbor, so that the incoming ship sailed right up to the stone-lined side. Seamen on shore, as well as on the ship, neatly tied her thick lines to the bollards on the wall. Sibel was not immediately visible, though as Manoli's fire lizards did a welcoming display above the ship's rigging, the westering sun glinted off 2 golden bodies, Sibel's queen, Kimi, as well as Manoli's beauty. Pemer didn't spot Sibel in the bustle of people unloading the ship until suddenly he appeared right in front of them, heavy bags draped across his shoulders and arms. A seaman carefully laid 2 more filled sacks at his feet, enough to load down a runner beast, all right. "Good trip, Sibel?" asked Manoli, picking up one of the sacks and slinging it with a deft twist of her wrist onto her back. "Give Pemer at least 1 yoke of those," she added, and Pemer sprang quickly to relieve Sibel of some of his burden, fingering the bulges to see if he could identify the contents. And don't maul it, Peemer. The herbs will be crushed soon enough. Herbs? Peemer? What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be rehearsing? Began Sibel. His smile was pleasant, and the whiteness of his teeth stood out against dark tanned skin. Herbs and a tan. Peemer would bet every mark he had that Sibel had just returned from the southern continent. Peemer's voice is broken. It has. There was no doubting Sibel's pleasure at the news, and Master Robinton's agreeable. Manoli grinned, with a slight variation, according to the wisdom of our good master. Oh? Sibel glanced first at Peemer and then back to Manoli for explanation. He's been told off as apprentice to Master Olodki. Sibel began to chuckle then. Shrewd of Master Robinton, very shrewd. Right, Peemer? I guess so. At such a sour rejoinder, Sibel threw his head back and laughed, startling his queen, who'd been about to land on his shoulder. She flew about his head, scolding, joined by Beauty and the two bronzes. Sibel threw an arm across Peemer's shoulder, telling him to cheer up, and draped his other arm about Manoli. Then he guided them toward the Hold stables.
Do you know where a pencil is?
There's one in that pink bag right there.
Can I use it?
Yes, you can, as long as you put it back. There was a look on Sibel's face that suggested to Peemer that the companionable arm about his shoulders had been an excuse for the one about Manoli's. The observation cheered Peemer, for he knew something no other apprentice did. Maybe not even Master Robinton. Or did he? Variations on that notion contented Peemer on the initial leg of their hallward trip. The last 3 hours were spent in increasing physical discomfort. For one thing, he had sacks strapped front and back of his pad and another slung over his shoulder. It was difficult to adjust his rear end and find a spot not already beaten to a pulp by the runner beast's action. Rather unfair of Manoli, Peemer thought with some rancor, to include him on an 8-hour ride, his first time on a runner in turns. He was immensely relieved that he wasn't expected to tend the mounts too, as they handed mount ropes to Bannock. Then Peemer wished he'd been able to dismount in the Harper Hall courtyard, for his stiff and seemingly reshaped legs made the short walk from Beast's Hold to Hall an unexpected torture. Sourly he listened to Manoli and Sibel chatting as they preceded him. They talked of inconsequentialities so that Peemer couldn't even ignore his aches by concentrating on their comments. Well, Peemer, said Manoli as they climbed the steps to the hall, you haven't forgotten how to pace a beast. Shells, what's the matter with you? It's been 5 bloody turns since I've ridden one, he said, trying to straighten his sorely afflicted back. Manoli! That's plain cruel, cried Sibel, trying to keep a straight face. Into the hot bath with you, lad, before you harden in that posture. Manoli was instantly contrite, with protests of dismay and apology. Sibel guided him to the bathing room, and when Manoli brought a tray of hot food for them all, she served Peemer as he floated in the soothing water. To Peemer's utter embarrassment, Sylvina appeared as he was patting his sore parts dry. She proceeded to slather him with numbweed salve, and, making him lie down, massaged his back and legs. Just when he thought he'd never move again, Sylvina made him get to his feet. Strangely enough, he could walk more normally. At least the numbweed deadened the muscular aches enough for him to make his own way across the court and up the 3 flights to the drum heights. He slept through 3 drum messages the next morning, the fire lizards feeding, and half the chorus rehearsal with instruments. When he woke, Dearzen gave him time for a cup of claw and a meat roll, then quizzed him on the drum measures assigned him the day before. To Dearzen's amazement, Peemer beat them out time perfect. He had had plenty of hours in which to memorize them on that runner's ride. As a reward, Dearzen gave him another column of measures to learn. The numbweed salve had worn off, and Peemer found sitting on the stool during his lesson agonizing. He had rubbed his seat bones raw, a combination of the stiffness of his new trousers and the riding. This affliction provided him with an opportunity to visit Master Oldive after lunch. Although Sibel's sacks were in evidence in Master Oldive's quarters, even to some herbs piled on the work table, Peemer pried no new snippets of information from the master healer, not even if this had been the first shipment of such medicines. He did learn that galls hurt even more when treated than when sat on. Then the numbweed took over. Master Oldive said he was to use a cushion for sitting for a few days, wear older, softened pants, and asked Sylvina for a conditioner to soften his wear-hide. No sooner had he returned to the drum heights than he was sent with a message for Lord Grohe to Fort Hold, and when he came back, set to stand a listening watch. He saw Manoli and Sibel the next morning when he fed his trio of fire lizards, but apart from a solicitous inquiry about his stiffness, the 2 Harpers were not talkative. The next day Sibel was gone, and Pemer didn't know when or how. He was able, however, to observe from the drum heights the comings and goings, in and out of Fort Hold, of riders on runners, of 2 dragons, and an incredible number of fire lizards. It occurred to him that while he'd been congratulating himself on knowing most of what went on in the Harper Hall, the drum heights let him observe the larger world which, up till that day, had been unremarked by himself. Several messages came in that afternoon, 2 from the north and 1 from the south. 3 went out, 1 in answer to Tillich's question from the north, an originating message to Egan Tanner Hall, and the 3rd to Master Brererit, the master herdsman. To tantalize him, all the messages were too quickly delivered for him to recognize more than a few phrases. Infuriated to be in a position to know more and unable to exercise the advantage to his full, Pemer memorized 2 columns of drum measures. If his zeal surprised Dearson, it irritated his fellow apprentices. They presented him with several all too forceful arguments against too much application on his part. Pemer had always relied on being able to outrun any would-be adversaries, but he discovered that there was no place to run to in the drum heights. While nursing his bruises, he stubbornly learned off 3 more columns, though he kept this private, tempering his recitations to Dearson. Discretion, he was learning, is required on many different levels. He was not sorry 6 days later to be told to take a message to a minehold situated on an awkward ridge in the Fort Hold range. With a signed Harper-sealed tube of record hide, he mounted the same stolid runner beast Bannock had given him for the previous trip. Gingerly settling the seat of his now well-softened warehide pants onto the pad, Pemer was relieved to feel no discomfort from his tailbones as the creature moved off. The journey should take him 2 to 3 hours, Bannock said, and he pointed out to him the correct southwestern track. 3 hours was probably correct, Pemer thought, as his efforts to increase the pace of his runner failed. By the time the wide track had narrowed to a thinner trace, winding against the stony hillside with deep gorges on the outside, Pemer was quite willing to let his runner go at that steady, careful pace. As he figured it would have taken the Fort Hold watch dragon only a few moments to make the trip, and the watch dragon's rider was quite willing to oblige the Master Harper of Pern, he wondered why he'd been sent, until he delivered his message to the taciturn mineholder. "You're from the Harper Hall?" The man scowled at him dubiously. "Apprentice to Master Alotki, the drum master." This could be some sort of test of his prudence. "Wouldn't have thought they'd send a boy on this errand," he said with a skeptical grunt. "I've 14 turns, sir," Pemer replied, trying to deepen his tone without notable success. "No offense meant, lad." "None taken." Pemer was pleased that his voice remained steady. The miner paused, his gaze drawn upward. Not, Pemer noticed, in the direction of the sun. When the miner began to scowl, Pemer also looked up. Though why the miner should register displeasure at the sight of 3 dragons in the sky, Pemer couldn't guess. True, threat had fallen only 3 days before, but you'd think dragons would be a reassuring sight at any time. "There's feed and water in the shed," said the miner, still watching the dragons. He gestured absently over his left shoulder. Obediently, Pemer started to lead the runner around, hoping that there would be something for himself as well when he tended the beast. Suddenly, the miner let out a startled oath and retreated into his hold cot. Pemer had only reached the shed when the miner came striding after him, thrust a small bulging sack at him. "This is what you were sent for. Tend your beast while I tend these unexpected arrivals." Pemer's trained ear did not miss the apprehension in the miner's tone, nor the implicit command that Pemer was to remain out of sight. He made no comment, stuffing the small sack in his belt pouch while the miner watched. The man left as Pemer vigorously pumped water into the trough for his thirsty beast. As soon as the miner reached his cot, Pemer changed his position so that he had a clear view of the one reasonably level area of the mine hold where the dragons could land. Only the bronze did. The 2 blues settled on the ridge above the mine opening. Sight of the great beast that back-winged to the ground told Pemer all he needed to know to understand the miner's grimness. Before their exile south, the old-timers from Fort Weir had made few appearances, but Pemer recognized Fidranth by the long scar on his rump, and Tron by the arrogant swagger as he strode up to the mine-cot. Pemer didn't need to hear the conversation to know that Tron's manner had not altered in his turn south. With a very stiff bow, the miner stepped aside as Tron, slapping his flying gloves against his thigh, strode disdainfully into the cot-hold. As the miner followed, he glanced toward the shed. Pemer ducked behind the runner. It needed little wit now to realize why the miner had thrust the sack at him. Pemer investigated the contents. Only 4 of the blue stones that spilled into his hand had been cut and polished. The others, ranging from one the size of his thumbnail to small uneven crystals, were rough. The blue sapphires were much prized by the Harper Hall, and stones as large as the 4 cut ones were mounted as badges for masters of the craft. 4 cut stones. 4 new masters walking the tables? Would Sabelle be one of them? Peemore wondered. Peemer thought a moment, and then slipped the cut stones carefully, 2 and 2, into his boots. He wiggled his feet until the stones settled.
Mom.
Sharp lumps against his ankles, but they'd not slip out. What?
You just said pee more.
Well, maybe he needs to pee more. I don't know. He wiggled.
It's true. They never include when they go to the bathroom. Do people just not go to the bathroom in these worlds?
They do.
When?
I guess only when it's relevant to the plot. He wiggled his feet until the stones settled. Sharp lumps against his ankles, but they'd not slip out.
But other than that, do they not have to go? Do they not
No,
have
never.
To pee?
They never go pee. Ever. He hesitated as he was about to stow the sack in his pouch. He doubted Tron would stoop to searching a lowly apprentice, but the stones made a suspicious bulge. Checking the leather to make sure it bore no miner's mark, he wrapped the thong on the back pad ring beside his drinking flask. Then he took off his jacket, folding the Harper badge inside before he slung it over the pump handle. Trail dust had turned his blue pants to a nondescript gray. The clink of boot nails on the ridge warned him, and whistling tunelessly, he picked up the beast's feet in turn, checking for stones in the cleft hooves. "You there!" The peremptory tone irritated Peemer. Natan never spoke like that, even to a kitchen drudge. "Sore?" Peemer unbent and stared around at the old-timer, hoping his anxious expression masked the anger he really felt. Then he glanced apprehensively at the miner, saw a harsh wariness in the man's eyes, and added in his best hill-hold jumble, "Sore he was that sweated. I've had a time cleaning him up." "You've other work to do," said the miner in a cold voice, jerking his head toward the cot-hold. "A day too late, am I, miner? Well, there's been yesterday's work, and this morning's." The old-timer superciliously gestured the miner to precede him toward the open shaft. Peemer watched, keeping a dull...
Who is the miner?
He's just the miner in this craft hold. Peemer watched, keeping a dull expression on his face as the 2 men disappeared from sight. Inwardly, he was right pleased with his dissembling, and was positive he'd seen an approving glint in the miner's eyes. By the time he'd finished grooming the runner from nose to dock, Tron and the miner had not yet reappeared. What other work would he have to do if he were a genuine miner's apprentice? It would be logical for him to stay far away from the shaft at the moment, for he'd be scared of the dragon rider, if not of his master. But the miner had indicated the cot-hold. Peemer pumped water into a spare pail and lugged it back to the cot-hold, ogling with what he hoped was appropriate fear the blue dragons ensconced on the ridge, the riders hunkered between them. The mine cot was divided into 2 large rooms, one for sleeping, the other for relaxing and eating, with a small portion... We're going to talk about that in a minute. That was great. That is great. With a small portion curtained off for the miner's privacy. The curtain was open, and plainly the disgruntled dragon rider had searched the press, locker, and bedding. In the kitchen area, every drawer was open and every door was ajar. A large cooking pot on the hearth was boiling so hard its contents frothed from under its cover. Not wishing what might be his meal in the ashes, Peemer quickly swung the pot away from the full heat of the fire. Then he began to tidy the kitchen area. No lowly apprentice would enter the master's quarters, however humble, without direct permission. He heard voices again, the miner's low comments and Tron's angry reproaches. Then he heard the sound of hammers against stone and ventured to look cautiously through the open slit window. 6 miners were squatting or kneeling, carefully chipping rough dark stone and dirt from the blue crystals possibly within. As Peemer watched, one of the miners rose, extending the palm of his hand toward the miner. Tron intercepted the gesture and held the small object up to the sun. Then he gave an oath, clenching his fist. For a moment, Peemer thought the old-timer was going to throw the stone away. "Is this all you're finding here now? This mine produced sapphires the size of a man's eye." 400 turns ago it did indeed, Dragon Rider, said the miner in an expressionless voice that could not be construed either as insolent or courteous. "We find fewer stones nowadays. The coarse dust is still good for grinding and polishing other gems. he added, as the old-timer stared at the man carefully brushing what seemed like glistening sand into a small scoop, which he then emptied in a small lidded tub. I'm not interested in dust, Miner, or flawed crystals. He held up his clenched fist. I want good, sizable sapphires. He continued to stand there, glaring at each of the miners in turn as they tapped cautiously away. Peemer, hoping that no larger sapphires would be discovered, made himself busy in the kitchen. By the time the sun was westering behind the highest of the ridges, only 6 medium to small sapphires had rewarded Tron's afternoon vigil. Peemer was not the only one to watch, half holding his breath as the old-timer stalked a Fidranth and mounted. The old bronze showed no faltering as he neatly lifted in the air, joined by the 2 blues. Only when the 3 had winked out between did the miners break into angry talk, crowding up to the miner, who brushed them aside in his urgency to get to the minecart. I see why you're a messenger, young Peemer, said the miner. You've got all your wits about you. Grinning, he extended his hand. Peemer grinned back and pointed toward his back pad and the sack with its precious contents, looped in plain sight on the ring. He heard the miner's astonished oath, which turned into a roar of laughter. You mean he spent all afternoon facing what he wanted? Cried the miner. I did put the cut gems in my boots, Peemer said with a grimace, for one of the stones had rubbed his ankle raw. As the miner retrieved the sack, the others began to cheer, for they'd had no chance to learn that the miner had managed to save the product of several 7 days' labor. Peemer found himself much admired for his quick thinking as well as his timely arrival. Did you read my mind, lad? Asked the miner, to know that I'd told the old grasper I'd sent the gems off yesterday. It seemed only logical, Peemer replied. He'd taken his boots off just then, examining the scratches the sapphires had made. It would have been a crying shame to let old Tron get away with these beauties. And what are we going to do, master? Asked the oldest journeyman, when those old-timers come back again in a few 7 days and take what we've mined? That placer's not played out yet. We're closing up here tomorrow, said the miner. Why? We've just found more. The miner signaled silence abruptly. Each craft has its privacy, said Peemer, grinning broadly. If the miner felt an apprentice required no apology for such curtness, he would not be admonished for impertinence for repeating a well-known rule. But I shall have to mention this to Master Robinson, if only to explain why I'm so late returning. You must tell the Master Harper, lad. He's got to know, if no one else. I'll tell Master Miner Nicket. Then he swung about the room with a warning look at each of his own craftsmen. You all understand that this matter goes no further? Well and good. Tron got only a few flawed stones. You are all very clever with your hammers today, though I deplore cracking good sapphires. The miner sighed heavily for that necessity. Master Nicket will know which other miners to warn. Let the old-timers seek if it amuses them. When the older journeyman laughed derisively, the miner went on, raising an admonishing finger at him. Enough. They are dragon men, and they did help Bend and Weir and Pern when aid was badly needed. Then he turned to Peemer. Did you save any of our stew, lad? I have the appetite of a queen dragon after clutching.
I stabbed my